Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Good morning. Welcome to our weekly debrief. This is our weekly deep breath when it comes to the news, especially during this rapid fire news cycle where we really aim to be quick, concise, and nonpartisan, always nonpartisan, sometimes not as quick as I would like, but we try that on a weekly basis. This is when we actually get the moment to sit with the news a little bit. We take a longer period of time to work through some of our big stories. And I found myself transported as I was looking through the stories of this week to a reporting experience I had on Ellis Island a couple years ago. And I actually want to start with telling you a little bit about that story because it's tragic in a few different ways. It was great, very educational, but also tragic, especially at the beginning of SmartHER News. As I was really launching into this stage as an entrepreneur, I had my two little kids with me at the time. I believe my son was 3 and my daughter was 2, and we were traveling in New York City. I was back in New York City for the very first time since I had left. Sort of suddenly, this idea that I was going to leave my job as a national news anchor and fling myself into entrepreneurship was not something that I had in my mind's eye, but it's what happened. It was very rapid when it ended up taking place, when that decision came into effect. And so we were back in New York City for the very first time. And I had this contact on Ellis Island. There's a historian there. His name is Barry Moreno. Some of you will remember my interview with him. I've talked to him repeatedly over the years, but I thought this is going to be great. I'm going to bring my children with me. We're going to see the Statue of Liberty. My little girl is named Liberty in part because of the Statue of Liberty. And I'm going to stay back on Ellis Island and do this interview with Barry Moreno, which I'll get to in a second. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that there are so many themes in the news this week: war, humanitarian aid, quarantining. What does quarantining look like, especially when you have communicable diseases, immigration, legal and illegal immigration? All of these sort of themes come up when you think about Ellis Island, or when I've done reporting about Ellis Island in the past. And some of this past can really be informative to our conversations this week about the news. So this is why I'm bringing this up. So I was able to go into this area of Ellis Island that I'd never been before. And when you go into Ellis Island, it looks very much like it always has. There's this huge hall where people were standing and being processed, and you really feel like you've walked back in time. So Barry Moreno invites me sort of to the back where the historians work. This is great, right? We're sitting underneath this amazing glass skylight. It's like an atrium. You're sitting far away from where people can see you, and the sun is shining through, and in the distance you can see the Statue of Liberty, and you're surrounded by like these books of like piled up and people doing important work, and it just felt amazing. And so I was sitting there with my computer. We set up microphones, and I was interviewing Mr. Moreno, who's like just a fascinating guy and able to speak about history in the way that you always want a historian to speak about, which can draw the things that you never knew that are commonly thought about a past event, illuminate them, and help apply them somewhat to our current experience. So he was just an amazing interview. So I'm sitting there and I'm just thinking, I'm just feeling so grateful. And we get to the end of the interview, his final answer. And I feel like that's it. We just had this great moment. I say, thank you so much. And I stop the recording, and then my computer starts pinwheeling. And you know what that means. I'm like, what's happening? What's going on? I had just done an interview like this previously with a historian in New Jersey, actually at Washington's Crossing, which is another story we've talked a lot about in SmartHER News. And so I thought it just needs a second. It's just hot. The computer's just hot. We've been talking for a while. That wasn't the case. I lost the entire interview. I didn't know it at the time. So I was like, okay, the computer, it's going to be fine. I sat there for a while, could no longer sit there, get the ferry to get back to Manhattan, get on the subway. I'm on the subway. My kids were back at the hotel with my husband, and I pull out my computer. It's still pinwheeling. I call Mac support. I didn't know what to do. I lost the entire interview. And that was a low point. I definitely still got the knowledge from the interview. And luckily Barry was amazing because I told him what happened and he ended up doing an interview with me. We just ended up I think we actually used Skype just a couple of years ago, when Skype was being used. Now we're all on Zoom all the time. But yes, that was, as I said, it was it's an amazing moment and a tragic moment at the same time. I've never made the same mistake. I don't do interviews that way anymore. But yeah, that was terrible. So anyways, I thought I would share that with you because I do want to talk a little bit about what we used to do in the United States when it came to legal immigration, when it also came to quarantine. This is coming up. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of the recent judge's ruling about the federal mask mandate. And some of what she talked about in that ruling, we covered a little bit on SmartHER News, and I'm going to work through it with you today. But she mentioned a couple points that referenced quarantine. What does a quarantine require? And we'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about the new immigration numbers that just came out this week. In any other news cycle, this would be driving the news cycle. I mean, these are the highest numbers of encounters that we've ever seen in modern data collection. There's a reason why I'm saying modern data collection. There's a reason why I'm saying encounters. There are really important things to pull out why we're talking in the way that we're speaking about these topics and why we're, in some ways, not that I'm being forced as a journalist to do that, but I'm trying to be consistent so we can compare numbers with past years. So we're going to talk a little bit about immigration, but I do want to start today just with an announcement by the President of the United States, because we just heard from the President. We always pay attention when the President talks. This was a scheduled address to the nation where he's speaking about providing more military aid and financial aid directly to Ukraine. So we're talking about another batch of hundreds of millions of dollars. And a lot of it is going to equipment, not necessarily direct financial aid, although direct financial assistance is part of it. The reason why I think this is important is we've seen billions of dollars go to Ukraine over the last several months, but also over the last several years. And this is your U.S. taxpayer money. And I think that you need to know where it's going. I also want to show you that this is coming in an interesting 24-hour period. So we're getting this announcement from the president. We're also seeing, this is the latest map from the Institute for the Study of War. This is what we've been referencing in the past. So this shows us what's happening in Ukraine right now when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine. You can see that the areas around Kyiv that used to be bright red, where we're continuing to watch conflict, all the way also in the north along the border with Belarus and with Russia, we're not seeing red there at all anymore. All of the fighting is in the eastern part of the country, where in the past there has been fighting for about the last 8 years, not in the huge swath that we're seeing. It certainly has expanded. But in this particular area, there has been conflict ongoing for years. And so one of the things the president said today is that the equipment that will be provided directly to Ukraine to support their efforts is going to be specific for this type of war fighting that we're seeing on the ground here. You can see that there's a variety of different areas that Russia has control of or is believed to be in control of. We know that Russia has that peninsula of Crimea that's already been annexed by Russia, but we're really particularly watching this area. I don't think we can say it enough, how important the Black Sea is, how important these waterways are to Ukraine to get goods out of the country, how important these waterways are to Russia, not only economically to get goods out of Russia and into the broader waterways of the Mediterranean and out into the rest of the world, but also militarily, because it gives the Russian Navy another area to strategically move. And so it's not just about what's happening in Ukraine. We have to also watch what's happening on the water here. This is a big part of the coastline for Ukraine, and we don't want to forget it. In the meantime, here's what Russia's doing. You might have heard a little bit about this. If you haven't, I've actually linked to it on our website as well. Excuse me. But this is a new intercontinental ballistic missile that Russia just tested yesterday. And again, we're just watching what's happened in the last 24 hours. So we're seeing Russia make moves in eastern Ukraine. There are reports, although we cannot confirm them, that There seems to be some advancement by Russia there, but then you get another report from the Institute of the Study of War, which is looking at this strategically and what's actually happening on the ground. And they say Russia hasn't made a lot of moves. So quite frankly, we don't really know how to call the game, if you will. I'm not trying to use too light of a statement, but we don't really know exactly what's happening on the ground. But here's what Russia's doing. They're firing off this intercontinental ballistic missile that they say is a unique weapon. The reason why we watch intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, as you might hear them talked about, we've talked about them related to North Korea, is because these are missiles that travel really far area. Intercontinental means it for a reason. And you could put a nuclear warhead on this sort of missile. Who has the largest nuclear arsenal in the entire world? Russia. We do as well, but Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal. So here's what's happened over the last 24 hours, right? Russia's firing off this missile. The United States said, oh yeah, they properly informed us that they were testing this. Mind you, a couple weeks ago, the Pentagon said we did not test an intercontinental ballistic missile because we didn't want to look aggressive to the world. So we waved off of a test that we had planned months in advance because we did not want to even give the appearance that we were posturing. Nevertheless, Russia's doing it here. The United States said that we heard a little bit about it. And then you have the Biden administration coming out today and saying we're pushing more money and resources to Ukraine to fight Russia. So that's just, again, the last 24 hours. I want to make sure that you see some of this video. Sometimes I feel mixed about playing video like this. I will show you. I mean, I don't think we hide anything from you, certainly. But, any video that's coming from the government, including from the U.S. government, I want to appropriately tell you, because this is video that the Russian government is producing and disseminating. And, is there any way for me to fact check and double source this? No. So this is the source for that. And I think that's important. So real quick on this, there is a tie to what's happening in Eastern Europe to also what's happening at the U.S. border. So let's hold these stories together in our hands at the same time. One of the things that we're seeing at the U.S. southern border is a much higher, significantly higher amount of Russians and Ukrainians coming to the U.S. southern border asking to come in. And one of the things that you should know is that typically, if you're a refugee, you apply for refugee status from outside the United States. Typically, you would do it in your home country if you could, but many Ukrainians cannot. And so that's refugee status. Asylum, to be an asylum seeker, you actually have to be on U.S. soil. This is one of the reasons why, in some cases, we see people come across the border illegally, but once they're on U.S. soil and they're approached by Border Patrol, they can say, I'm an asylum seeker. I'd like to apply for asylum. And if they're deemed that they could pursue asylum in the United States, and that puts them on a different track than somebody that Border Patrol comes across that clearly is not looking to appeal for asylum and may be arrested or expelled under this Title 42 that we've been using in the United States for a couple of years. This is a policy that dates back to the 1940s that basically allows the United States to expel people when there is disease. And so we've been able to quickly expel people. And this has had a little bit of a double-edged sword because in some cases it's allowed Border Patrol to take these much larger numbers we're seeing at the U.S. southern border and quickly move them back out, mainly to Mexico, even if they're not from Mexico. But because it's such a quick process, what Border Patrol is saying is that leads to multiple attempts. So let's say I come in, I'm expelled very quickly, and then in another couple of weeks, I decide to try again. And so one of the reasons why we're using the term encounters is because this is a term that the Biden administration is using. Now, let me just explain this. So we got what's happening in Eastern Europe. We know that there's more people that are not typically found at the U.S. southern border or coming to the U.S. southern border. By the way, that includes people, let's say, from Cuba. We're seeing much higher numbers of Cubans at the U.S. southern border. So the story of what's happening at the U.S. southern border isn't just about Mexico and Central America and South America. The numbers are growing exponentially. They are rising. The numbers we received last month are the highest numbers that we've ever seen. Again, in any other news cycle, this would drive it. The reason why this matters is not only because it's historic, but typically April, May, June, these are months with historically higher numbers because the weather I mean, it's certainly very hot in Texas during this time. That's a factor. But we tend to see more people move during this time than other times of the year. So when I see numbers like this in March, just because of historic precedent, we would expect these numbers to grow and grow and grow. And that's why we believe, based on the numbers from the last 6 months, we could see more than 2 million encounters at the U.S. southern border alone. The reason why I'm using the term encounters is because it's not necessarily multiple people. So let's say I'm encountered in January and then I'm encountered again in March. You know, it's the same person being encountered, and U.S. Border Patrol is saying, hey, there's a lot of these repeated attempts. But taking that for what it is, these numbers are still really high regardless. Even if you have repeat quote unquote offenders, you're still seeing historic numbers. And this is a major issue. So let's just talk about encounters for a second. What the Biden administration is calling encounters, this umbrella term to refer to anyone that's encountered if they cross the southern border. So someone like, let's say like myself, who's traveling with a child, who's applying for asylum, I could be encountered. I'm not arrested because Border Patrol says, yeah, she actually has a argument for asylum. We're going to allow her to go through the legal proceeding to do this. I'm typically, in this case, able to stay in the United States pending my case coming up. But let's say I'm not traveling with a child. I'm traveling with a criminal organization and I'm expelled or I'm arrested. All of that is under encounters. What the Trump administration used and the Obama administration as well is the term apprehension. Apprehension was the same thing basically as encounters, but apprehension in some ways can insinuate that I've been apprehended by the government, that I've been taken into custody, that I might be arrested. And that is true. I might have been, but I may not have been. And so that's why you see different administrations use different terms. Guess what? We've seen this for the last several decades. So why do we say this is the highest number in recent modern data collection is because we're trying to compare the number to the number one available data that we can get easily, but also in a consistent way to previous administrations. And that gets real messy because different administrations want to use different terms. They want to put forward a different portrayal on immigration. And so let me give you another example. We used to use the term deportation quite often, right? Deportation is a legal proceeding. That means I was found in the United States. I shouldn't be here. I'm going to go through a legal proceeding and then I'm going to be officially deported. Well, I could also be removed. That's deportation, but maybe I didn't go through the full legal proceeding, but I was removed, or I could be returned, which means that I didn't go through the legal proceeding, but in some way it was negotiated that then I would just go ahead and be returned, not necessarily to my home country. Again, I could just be returned to Mexico. And so if you really want to slice and dice through all these terms that the Bush administration used and then the Obama administration used and the Clinton administration, I mean, it gets very messy. I choose typically to follow what the Justice Department's using at the time. And right now I'm going to use the term encounters, although I want to be very clear that in some cases, people that are encountered are arrested. Sometimes they are apprehended. They are mostly, if they're encountered, at one time in U.S. custody, not necessarily because I am legally detaining them, but because if Border Patrol comes across a group of 100 people, suddenly Border Patrol is going to take them into our care. What happens if someone's sick? They don't get left. They're not getting left there on the side of the road. They're getting care. And so they're then brought into government custody in some capacity. And these different legal definitions can get very confusing. So I just want you to be aware that when we talk about, 2 million encounters at the U.S. border, we're saying that in part because you could see repeated people being encountered. But, to a U.S. Border Patrol agent, they're still encountering these high numbers. They're not like, oh yeah, that's that guy that I encountered before. No, I mean, these are really high numbers that they're encountering. These are individuals that are coming across every single month. And yes, maybe they came across in previous months, but does it matter? It's still requiring the same amount of resources to deal with who is being encountered. Does that make sense? So even if it was a repeat offender, I'm still having to deal with the people that are in front of me if I'm Border Patrol. So, I just think it's important to have that little asterisk when it comes to the word encounter. This is why we're using it. We're trying to be consistent. And let me just show you what this looks like in a graph. It's a tough story to kind of get your hands around. But if you take a look at this graph here, and for those of you who are listening later, what we're really seeing are these kind of graph lines that are showing us what does immigration look like in over the last several years. And the blue line is showing us a very high arc that we haven't seen previously in recent years. And what we're seeing in a yellow line, which is a line straight up, is what we're seeing in this particular year. So you can see how different it is. 2019 was a really big year for immigration, illegal immigration, regular immigration, conflict at the U.S. southern border. 2019, of course, was during the Trump administration. That you can see in orange, and you can see how different the last couple years have been. The red line is 2020, which is, when the pandemic hit and the border was completely shut down. Not a great year for comparison sake. So we're going to use the other lines that show, well, this is what things look like right now. And again, the statistic, the pace is really significant. I want you to know about this for a couple of different reasons. Number one, let's just talk about caring about people. We don't want people to get hurt. I actually care about you. We actually care about each other. And what's happening at the U.S. southern border is good for nobody. It's not good for anybody. We don't want to incentivize human trafficking. We don't want to incentivize more people coming to the U.S. southern border and trying to come across illegally, even if they are applying for asylum, because that's bad news. That puts them in a really bad situation. And let's say they come across, they're not encountered by Border Patrol. They want to apply for asylum, but they're kind of aimlessly moving in America, trying to find their place. That's not good. They can easily be exploited then. So this is not good for anybody. We don't really talk about illegal immigration or asylum seeking in this way. The reason why the border matters is because we don't want that happening to people. We don't want families risking their lives to try to come across the U.S. southern border to apply for asylum. We want to figure out a better way to care for people, right? We don't want that to happen. In addition to that, the drain of resources is really important. The amount of money that it's taking to patrol the southern border, the amount of money it's taking for resources to care for people along the U.S. southern border matters. And then politically, we know this is a major issue. It comes up every election. And here's why this is a good preview for us for the midterms, is that we're going to get those high summer numbers right before the midterm elections. So you better believe this is going to be one of the major issues that's going to be talked about by politicians. And both Democrats and Republicans have had opportunity to lead on this particular issue and try to figure out some sort of immigration reform. There's been talk of, temporary worker programs, all sorts of things. Neither party has been able to gather enough consensus amongst their own parties really to move forward in any consistent, meaningful way that hasn't been legally challenged later, for example. So, this is just an ongoing issue. And when you see those numbers so high, we wonder what is the dynamic that actually changes it. One of the interesting things to this story and to this idea that we're also seeing more Eastern Europeans at the U.S. southern border is there's a new program apparently that the administration is putting out where they're saying now that if Ukrainians have a sponsor in the United States, and I don't know, I just saw this news. It just kind of came out just over the last couple hours. If they have a sponsor in the United States, that they'll be able to basically come into there would be able to seek more of a legal status to be able to come into the United States. I don't know how much that differs from what's required for you as a refugee. But what's interesting about that is in Ellis Island. Remember, Ellis Island, people like to compare what we're seeing at the border to Ellis Island. But Ellis Island was legal immigration. You were going through a legal process to legally enter the United States. What's happening at the U.S. southern border is not that. There is an illegal entry into the United States often. Again, often there's an illegal entry to the United States. And then there's someone that is applying for or appealing for asylum. It's different. So we got to be careful with some of those comparisons. By the way, once you're on U.S. soil and you can legally apply for asylum, they can do that. This is so, again, even though there may be a infraction of law coming across the border, by the way, it's a very minor offense. It's a very minor offense. If you come across the border illegally, if you're appealing for asylum, then you're legally allowed, you have protection under U.S. law if you're legally allowed to stay. But what's happening in Ellis Island is that if you came over and you said, hey, I'm traveling with my son, I'd like to stay in the United States, what would happen to me? I would be examined. And this is going to tie to what happened with the federal judge and the mask mandate. I would be examined, medical inspection, to make sure I looked okay, sounded okay. Why? Because they didn't want me to go into the country, and especially go into areas, let's say farming communities or the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and have a communicable disease. They didn't want that. So they inspected me. And if I had to be quarantined, I would quarantine on Ellis Island. That did happen. But I also had to say I had someone to go see. So I had to say my husband is working in San Francisco at a nursery, gardening area, not necessarily for kids, but this is actually true. My great grandmother came through Ellis Island. She was traveling with 2 young kids. She was meeting her husband. Her husband was in California. They were working in, different jobs as immigrants do. Italian immigrants were working in coal mines. And eventually part of the family had like a gardening nursery that they were working as part of. So I would have to say I have a destination. If I did not have a destination, I was not allowed to stay. Can you believe that? I was not allowed to stay. And why was that? They didn't want a young woman, I hope I'm a young woman still, a young woman with her child coming into the country with nowhere to go. Because the chances, if I didn't have any support, that I would turn into a lady of the night was high. They didn't want me to turn to crime. They didn't want me to be a drain on the community. And so they wanted to know, was someone going to answer for me? By the way, sometimes you had to be picked up. In a lot of cases, you had to be picked up. You had to say, there he is. Now, was there some fraud in this? Yeah, there was some fraud that was happening. People were posing as people, sure. But this was part of the process, right? We don't want you to bring disease in, and we don't want you to be a drain. And we need to make sure that you have support. And by the way, oh, you're Italian? Oh, by the way, you're Catholic? Okay, here's the name of an organization that deals with people like you. Goodbye. Oh, you're Irish? Oh, you're Protestant? Oh, okay, this is it. You see, they would even match people to charity organizations because the idea was we are supporting the American community and culture. So we're going to figure out ways to make sure that you're coming in with good intentions and that you're going to be a positive member of the community. Didn't always work, but they certainly were able to process a lot of people on a regular basis. And so I think that's a good point of context just to remember about how we once used to deal with immigration. Again, legal immigration. You want to know who ran that? Was it like the department? Was it Customs and Border Protection? No, that didn't exist. It was the Labor Department. A lot of this was under the Labor Department because immigration was looked at as a way to support the U.S. economy. And that was a priority for the government. And so this is how they handled it in Ellis Island. Very interesting. So let's tie what we kind of learned about quarantining in Ellis Island, medical inspection, and why that historical reference matters to what the judge ruled this week about mask mandates on the federal mask mandates on public transportation. So there were a couple reasons for her ruling, and obviously this is being heavily debated. We just learned that the CDC just issued a statement just on Tuesday that said, no, we actually believe that masking on public transportation is still really important. And because of that, the Justice Department came out and said, okay, we're going to start the process of an appeal. So it looks like the U.S. government is going to challenge the judge's ruling to strike down this mask mandate. So far, in this very early stage, the Justice Department is not asking for a stay. They're not saying that we should wear masks until this can be properly appealed. And I'm curious to see how far this appeal goes, because it's once the genie's out of the bottle, right? Like once no one's wearing a mask on an airplane and the airlines are like, no one's wearing a mask anymore because it's been so difficult for them to manage. Can you imagine putting it back on? That's a very difficult thing. It's also very difficult to have this sort of legal battle ahead of a major election in November. And when you're not necessarily seeing the rise in hospitalizations and deaths, it's not that COVID is over, but you're not necessarily in a spike. That's one of the reasons why the judge overruled the mask mandate. It wasn't just because she said that these sort of mandates can stand if she was basically going back again to a rule in the 1940s, a law in the 1940s that said the United States is empowered to take a series of different steps if there is communicable disease. And Here's how you can enforce the regulation to do that. You could do pest extermination. You can inspect someone's stuff. You can sanitize. And what she was saying is, of all the things that were listed, sanitation was what she thought most applied here. What she did is she looked at the actual definition of sanitation in 1944. Different legal scholars will look at this differently. They will say, okay, you're going to take what was written in 1944 and you're either going to really take it in as it was intended in 1944, or we should read it as we understand it in 2022. And you have different legal thoughts on that. But she decided, I'm going to go to 1940. I'm going to go to the dictionary. This is what she did. It's in her ruling. I'm going to go to the dictionary. I'm going to see in 1944 how the word sanitation was used. And what she came to was that a mask actually doesn't sanitize anything, and therefore it can't be considered sanitation, and therefore it can't be a law. This is part of her thinking. Okay. This is part of her argument. She was saying this is far beyond the government authority because it's not sanitation. But she also said that if you do not wear a mask and then you're not able to fly, it is effectively the government quarantining you. And therefore, in order to be quarantined, you would have to be considered to be reasonably infected. And she said there was no one that could determine someone was reasonably infected just because they were not wearing a mask on an airplane. This was, again, going back to the past. The other thing she said is that the government didn't follow proper procedure. So they put in the mandate in effect without 30 days of open public comments. And the people that were suing over this were saying that they felt increased anxiety because of wearing masks. One of the reasons why they were suing. And she said, if you follow proper procedure, someone like this would have been able to appeal to the CDC and say, hey, I don't like this because I'm not able to follow this because of X, Y, and Z. She said you didn't do that and you had time to because we weren't in a period where there was an upswing of hospitalizations and death. It wasn't an emergency period part of the pandemic when this went into effect. It just sort of went into effect and you were wrong. So these are a couple of the reasons why she made this ruling. So we'll see. We'll see what the Justice Department does and whether or not they really want this fight. If they really, really want this fight, we'll see an appeal. We'll see what happens. But this is the last mandate that we're really seeing stand right now. When you think about the vaccine mandates, the mask mandates in places like California and New York, I'm listing the states that have had the strictest regulations. A lot of these mandates are gone. Philadelphia put their mask mandate back in effect. I mean, we could see them kind of come and go. But a city has more leeway to do that than, let's say, a federal government over all public transportation. So again, we'll see if that's the fight that the government really, really wants and if they think that they could win. So we'll see. We'll see. Some of you have asked a lot about Shanghai and what's happening there. Two things I learned about Shanghai and this is from a report from the Associated Press. Just want to mention it. So we've been watching these major lockdowns in Shanghai. One of the things that the Associated Press did, and I'll include this report underneath this video on our website so you could reference it if you like to see it, is there have been a really low number of recorded deaths due to COVID, but we're seeing higher cases. So what's going on? One of the things that the Associated Press is reporting, and I'm referencing them because it's difficult for reliable information from inside China. What they're saying is that in the United States, if COVID is a factor or a factor or a contributing force to someone's death, then that person's death will be listed as a COVID death. So we've talked about some of the debate over this, but it's either a factor or a major contributor or a source of the person's death, then they could be listed as a COVID death. In Shanghai, if you have any other pre-existing conditions, let's say you have heart disease, but you had COVID and you were sick with COVID for several weeks and then you ended up passing away, that you would not be counted as a COVID death because you had these other conditions. And so there's something like 24 COVID deaths when you have tens of thousands of people that have tested positive. And we know that there's some hospitalizations. So there's a question about the data there, and it shows how different governments are looking at the data differently. One of the things I've talked to you about is that a lot of the Shanghai cases are asymptomatic. And how do we understand asymptomatic here? We understand asymptomatic here is like you feel pretty much fine. Not even a runny nose, not even really sneezing, not coughing. In Shanghai, asymptomatic means that you don't have pneumonia. So you could be coughing and sneezing and they would consider you asymptomatic. You have to have a X-ray of your lungs that show you that you have pneumonia to show that you have symptomatic COVID. Otherwise, the sneezing, the coughing, considered asymptomatic. So that's a good lesson to me because there'd be, numbers. Let's say we had 25,000 people that were testing positive for COVID in Shanghai, and 90% of them are asymptomatic. And I was talking to you about that. And we know that there was regular testing of people. So people aren't going in and getting testing just because they're sick. They're getting tested regularly. So the idea that they could find asymptomatic cases, that you get a positive case, it seems totally plausible. But now we're learning, well, maybe they're asymptomatic cases. We're not exactly what we would consider asymptomatic. And there's really a question here as well. So when we say that we're asymptomatic, like, are we really asymptomatic? Are you sure you don't have like a little cough, a little something going, a little fever, a little something like that, Well, a lot of moms are walking out around saying they're totally fine when, we're like, hacking up, it's allergies. It's allergies. It's not anything else, So anyways, I thought that was a really interesting point. I know that's a big story that a lot of you have really had a great interest in. So we'll continue to watch that. But I'm curious what you think. If there's any other questions that you'd like to go over before we end here today, we've covered a lot of really big topics. And I think really one of the big things that we come away from the news every week, and I don't mean to repeat it, but that it just is so true in our lives, and it's so true in the news that words really matter. How we're using them, what we're inferring by them. It's a center for all of these different stories that we just looked at, whether it's immigration or mask mandates or others. So if you have any other questions before I jump off, you guys have been so great today, and I really appreciate all of your support. This has been such a kind of a time that I feel like we have a little bit of a pause. There's a little bit of a sort of this pause in the news. I don't know if you sense it as well. We have a lot of really big stories. And in some ways, they're sort of competing for bandwidth. I'm watching some of the news that is getting distracted on, I don't want to say it's almost like more media stories rather than actual news stories. The media really likes to cover itself. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. But there's a lot of that. Some of you are asking about what's happening in Israel and what's happening between Israelis and Palestinians and that conflict that's ongoing. We've been looking at what's happening in Israel over the last couple of weeks. Separately from this, there were a series of terrorist attacks that happened in Israel in a short period of time. And remember, we're in this whole, Ramadan, a holy period for Muslims, Passover, holy period for those of a Jewish faith. So I am going to take a closer look at that story. It's not one that I've been able to dig into deeply. But it's something that I'm definitely going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks. I'm looking at you guys. I know there's a lot of arguments here already. I can see some, and there's a lot of different debates about how the CDC has tracked COVID numbers. I'm just going to leave you with this. It's easy, believe me, because I've gone there. It's easy to get sort of trapped into really attributing a feeling to why people are making certain decisions. So, it can feel nefarious at times. Right? Why do we have a mask mandate? Why do people want this sort of control? Why are we counting COVID numbers this way? Why are we trying to inflate the pandemic? Listen, I think these are actually really important questions to ask. Are we being accurate with our data? That is fundamentally an issue that we found with the pandemic. But when I look across the different stories, what I like to do is step back and say, hey, listen, let's just, for a second, we can go down the dark path of like, there's something else going on, and in any number of stories, right? Any number of stories. But then I want to also reframe the story and say, okay, well, let's say that everyone's trying to do the best that they can. When it comes to public health policy, this idea of a mask mandate is definitely one of public health policy. We know that our doctors, if we talk to any number of our doctors, would give us varying different advice. My doctor might tell me to wear a mask on an airplane because of my certain health conditions, but your doctor may not. And this is the difference between personal health policy and public health policy. These have been at friction with each other since the beginning of the pandemic. And we've gotten a dose of public health policy that none of us have gotten in our entire lives, watching the government try to figure out the way that they would like to curb the pandemic. One of the things that's been difficult with the masking, and I'll just leave you with this, with the mask mandates, and has always come up, is yes, we do have studies that would suggest that wearing masks will reduce infection in a community, but we also have variables in those communities that can be difficult to rule out. For example, if you have a mask mandate in a community that mainly is a rural community and you're seeing very low rates of COVID, is it because the kids are masking in school? Or is it because for the most part, no one's living in close proximity to each other and they're not on public transportation? They really don't intersect with each other very much and they have a lot of outdoor time. Can you outrule some of that? So some of the mask mandates and some of the mask research both can point to certain conclusions, but also have certain limitations. One of my favorite studies, I have a favorite study from the CDC. One of the more interesting studies I saw was with hairdressers. So there was these two hairdressers. This is at the beginning of kind of in the middle of the pandemic. They were both positive for COVID. They were wearing masks and the people in their shop, it sounded kind of like a Great Cuts. There was a lot of people coming through all the time. So they both are positive, highly symptomatic for COVID. They don't realize that they are. They're talking to each other without masks on, but they have masks on while cutting people's hair. And so the question was, well, how many people actually got COVID? And the answer was zero. Zero of the people actually got COVID. And the CDC was like, see, it's masking, right? They're masking. The people are masking. No one got COVID. Masks work. But then you also have the exceptions, which are, well, how long were they actually cutting someone's hair? How often was the hairdryer on for ventilation? And I'm not trying to argue with whether or not masks work. I'm just saying that there are exceptions and limitations to all the research. And there's exceptions and limitations to all the data we're getting. We're seeing that with immigration. We're seeing that when we look at how we're recording COVID deaths and cases. We see that varying from community to community, state to state, and also country to country. And so that's why it does get difficult to compare. And we just have to recognize those limitations. We don't have to sit with them. We just have to recognize them. And that's why it's important to give you all the information. So then you can decide, well, do you believe that no one got COVID because they were wearing masks? Or do you think it was because of the hairdryer? Because most of these were quick cuts. What was the reason? Or maybe they weren't at a certain point in their infection. They weren't they were symptomatic for themselves, but maybe they weren't at the highest point of contagion. It's tough to know. This is one of the things with mask studies. We don't know if everyone was wearing the mask the right way. We don't know how secure the masks were. We don't know what kind of mask they were wearing. This all comes into effect. So that's why I think you lay off all the information on the table and then you decide what you think of it. I think that's the best way to go about this. So anyways, those are just a couple of things I think to think about today. Really appreciate all your support of SmartHER News. I look forward to hearing more on what stories you'd like to hear more about next week. So keep me posted. So questions and comments, always let me know, and more on all these stories on smarternews.com. I'm going to post a couple of links to the stories that we covered underneath this video on our website and on YouTube. So you could reference if you'd like. And always remember, all of our audio goes on Apple Podcasts. So if it's easier for you to listen to this on podcast, I want it to be as seamless as possible in your life. All right. Have a great day. And I'll see you with more on smarternews.com. Bye, guys.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan SmartHER News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing SmartHER.